Deeply divided over how much oil to pump, OPEC ministers meet in Vienna after a sharp decline in global oil prices. While some member states favor a cut in oil production to drive up prices, others are eager to maintain the current levels. And with Saudi Arabia pumping more to compensate for the decreasing Iranian market share, the divisions look set to continue. OPEC, the politics of oil and the global economy. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, begins its two-day quarterly meeting in Vienna with the 12-nation group split on whether to cut production quotas. After a 22% drop in crude prices from early last month, some OPEC members, such as Iran and Venezuela, are in favor of an output reduction to help push prices up. Saudi Arabia, the group's biggest producer, is expected to call for production levels to remain the same. During the meeting, the group that controls some 40% of the world's oil is also to decide on its next leader. Nicole Johnston reports.
Sanctions against Iran have dominated the oil industry this year. The US pressured Europe and Asia not to buy Iranian oil. So Saudi Arabia stepped in, started pumping more oil and doubled its number of tankers to deliver it.
That announcement that they had actually done that caused a reaction and criticism by Iran and others that you are undermining OPEC as an organization, that the price is going too far down and so on.
Iran sent a letter of complaint to OPEC, accusing Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates of producing more oil than they should. Iran's oil minister, Rostam Qasimi, says,
"It is not right that 2 or 3 countries compensate for a country that is targeted by sanctions. OPEC members should not work against each other. Increasing production by some OPEC members, especially Saudi Arabia, will create instability in the market and will likely lead to a serious decline in oil prices, which undermines OPEC's goals."
And the oil price has recently fallen. It's at around $100 a barrel, a 16-month low. Iran needs at least $117 a barrel to balance its budget. Then there's the issue of who should lead OPEC. Abdullah al-Badri from Libya retires at the end of the year. Last time the Secretary-General position came up, the deadlock lasted 3 years. Now both Iran and Saudi Arabia want the job.
If he's an Iranian appointee, he has to represent and defend Saudi Arabia, defend of all of OPEC. If he is from Saudi Arabia, that Secretary-General also has to defend Iran and others. It is that choice. I think we should not make it to a political issue.
OPEC has the power to change the global price of oil. But getting everyone to agree on what needs to be done is always its first challenge. Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera.
So who controls OPEC and just how relevant is this organization today? To answer this, we're joined by Sadegh Zibakalam, Professor of Politics at the University of Tehran, and Julian Lee, Senior Energy Analyst at the Center for Global Energy Studies in London. Professor Zibakalam, Saudi Arabia coming under increasing pressure from fellow OPEC members, including Iran, to cut oil production in order to stop this decline in the price of oil. Why is Saudi Arabia so resistant?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It appears that the Saudis are thinking that they belong to this school of thought that if oil prices is very high in the international market, then what it will do, it will harm in the long run the benefit of the oil producing country, because it will make other energies more competitive with the oil, and it will make Westerners to consume less oil, and also it means that other resources which hitherto have been very expensive and not compatible with the oil, they can now, if the oil prices is too high, they can now compete with the oil prices. That's why the Saudis have this conservative view, and they try very hard not to let oil prices to go up. And of course, the easiest way to go about it would be to produce more oil, and that's exactly what the Saudis are doing.
Julian Lee, why would Saudi Arabia do this, though, maintain these levels of oil production, when you would expect that bringing the prices of oil up would actually benefit all of the OPEC members, including Saudi Arabia itself?
Well, I don't think it would, and I think everything that has been said about the long-term impact of high oil prices is I think true. I think at the moment, though, there is a very strong short-term reason why Saudi Arabia is doing what it's doing, and it's not about the long-term substitution of other things for oil or the long-term decline in oil demand. It's about the possibility of high oil prices causing an immediate slowdown in the global economy, a failure of the global economy to recover from its recent recession, which would have not a long-term detrimental effect on OPEC, but an immediate detrimental effect on OPEC. We've seen the Eurozone fall back into recession. We've seen China's economic growth stumble in the first quarter of this year. I think we'll see it continue to stumble in the second quarter. We're seeing the US recovery, where the economy is growing a little bit, largely because of higher US oil production, but jobs aren't being created. People aren't buying goods. If people in the US and Europe aren't buying goods, China and India and other Asian developing countries aren't making those goods. That's
but Julian
why
Lee,
their
there
economic
isn't an
growth
increase,
is
though.
falling.
There isn't an increase clearly in global demand for oil. So why should Saudi Arabia then overproduce?
Isn't.
Why should it in fact go beyond its 8 million barrels a day?
It's been producing because when oil prices got up to $120 a barrel, the IMF and the Saudi Ministry of Finance both agreed that high oil prices and any subsequent rise in oil prices would be extremely damaging for the global economy. The global economy could not withstand oil prices at $125 a barrel and higher and continue growing. And what Saudi Arabia has done is to attempt to bring oil prices back to a level that allows the global economy to grow in the short term and allows oil demand to grow in the short term, therefore providing income for the OPEC countries.
But many would argue, though, that this policy is at the detriment of OPEC members. Professor Zibakalam, do you feel that way? Do you feel that this policy is aimed at undermining the interest of Iran, say, aimed at weakening its economy, which is already under pressure from sanctions?
Certainly, it's not only Iranians who are complaining and disagreeing with the Saudi policy. Algerians, the Venezuelan and the Iraqis. There are other members of OPEC which are not happy with regard to the Saudi policy. And I also must add another one further point to what my colleague Julian said in London, and that is the Saudis are trying to, as it were, to try to help Iranian enemies as far as oil embargo on oil sanction is concerned. The Saudis are in fact persuading Westerners, don't worry about the impact of higher oil prices as a result of oil embargo and as a result of oil sanction on Iran. That is also another very important factor for the Saudis.
Julian Lee, as Professor Zibakalam just pointed out, it isn't just the Iranians complaining. In fact, Libya has been complaining, saying that anything below $100 a barrel is painful for their economy. Saudi Arabia's strong Gulf ally, the United Arab Emirates, saying, the oil minister saying recently that production was a bit much. So, in fact, there is now a growing chorus of voices that are opposing this Saudi policy. And the statute of OPEC itself says, and I quote, that one of its aims is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member states. The question is, how powerful is Saudi Arabia then? Can it continue to ignore these other voices from within OPEC?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen OPEC for the last 12 months being fairly dysfunctional ever since the meeting of June last year, where they failed to reach any agreement whatsoever, leaving effectively all members to produce what they could or what they wished. The December meeting was marginally better, where they managed at least to paint a picture of unity and come out with an overall production figure of 30 million barrels a day, but with no indication of how that might break down for individual members. So again, effectively leaving all members to produce what they want. But I must go back to this sort of idea of the OPEC statute. The OPEC statute also says that one of the aims of the organization is to bring stability to oil markets. Now, we hear people saying, oh, well, oil prices have dropped 20% or whatever in the last month and a half. Yes, that's true. They rose 25% in the month and a half before that. So what Saudi Arabia has done, perhaps, is to bring oil prices back to where they were at the beginning of the year. And I think if we saw oil prices go up to, say, $120 a barrel again, by the end of this year, they would probably be down at 50 or 60, back to a repeat of what happened in the second half of 2008. And that would be even more damaging for the economies of Libya and Venezuela and others who seem to think somehow that an oil price of $120 a barrel has no repercussions on the global economy. It does.
But what about the spirit of OPEC itself, Professor Zibakalam? When the European Union set in place these sanctions against Iran that will kick in on the 1st of July, Saudi officials said quite openly that they would make up for the loss in Iranian oil through increased production. Does that surprise you? I mean, does that go counter to the spirit of OPEC, to this idea of cooperation and solidarity that member states, you would expect, would show each other?
Unfortunately, relations between Riyadh and Tehran they haven't been very good during the past few years. In fact, the problem is that the Saudis are representing U.S. and, broadly speaking, the Western interest in the Middle East. And Iran obviously is opposing with that attitude, and Iran is opposing United States and the Western interest. So unfortunately, things haven't been going very well between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not saying that if things politically were better between Tehran and Riyadh, we would have seen more cooperation between Saudi and Iran in OPEC. But certainly, the political animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia doesn't help to reach price agreement as far as OPEC is concerned.
Let's put in context, if we could now, the sort of influence that OPEC wields today. Hampered by sanctions, Iran's oil production has fallen to its lowest level in about 10 years by more than a quarter, from 2.2 million barrels a day last year to about 600,000 barrels a day now. Shipments of crude oil from Iran are also expected to drop further when a European Union oil embargo takes effect on the 1st of July. Now, top oil exporter Saudi Arabia pumped 9.8 million barrels of crude oil a day last month, which is the highest rate in the past 20 years. Meanwhile, oil production in the US grew to over 6 million barrels per day during the first quarter of 2012, which is the highest in 14 years. Russia is the world's top producer of crude oil. Its output stood at 10.36 million barrels a day in March, unchanged from a post-Soviet monthly high in February. So Julian Lee, aren't we making a little too much then of OPEC's influence in determining the price of oil when you consider that its member states account for just about over 40% of the world output?
Well, they account for 40% of the world's output, but they collectively account for 100% of the world's spare capacity. That means that the OPEC member countries are the only ones that can make a political or economic decision to raise their production or indeed to lower their production, as they're the only ones who have ever seemed willing to change their production for political or economic ends. And it's that flexibility, that ability to change their production quickly that gives them the power. There's no other producer that can raise their production in the way that Saudi Arabia has done over the last 6 months. And there's no other group of producers who would be prepared to cut their production in the way that OPEC did in early 2009. And that's what gives them their power, not their level of production.
What about the system under which OPEC operates, Professor Zibakalam? For the past couple of decades, OPEC has been operating under this quota system. But there are always cheaters, as we know, including Saudi Arabia, which is producing beyond the allotted quota that it has. Do you think the system is viable? Is it fair?
Yes, I think the system is viable, provided that large member of OPEC, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, if they can agree on a common policy as far as OPEC is concerned. And also, it is not only Saudi Arabia, other members of OPEC actually have been violating their quota. But I think the quota is not terribly an important issue because Saudi Arabia has always maintained that I will produce as much as I can and as much as I think the Saudi Arabia feel that it is necessary, regardless of what the quota is. So the quota is as you correctly raised it, the quota is actually meaningless. So when the quota is meaningless, then it's not very important to talk about who is cheating and who is not cheating.
But is the quota system completely meaningless, Julian Lee, when you've got countries like Saudi Arabia that are allowed to pump a certain amount of barrels a day, not commensurate with their population, and when you've got a country like Iran allowed to pump half that amount with a much larger population? Is the system fair, or is it inherently flawed in that sense?
Well, I mean, OPEC set a quota system based on a number of parameters, perhaps the strongest of which was negotiation. Population wasn't a criteria that was adopted for determining quota. I think you have to bear in mind, I mean, you talk about Saudi Arabia being the country that's raised its production and is overproducing. Saudi Arabia was also the first country, and indeed for many months the only OPEC member country, to cut its production when the demand for OPEC oil was falling very, very sharply in the second half of 2008. So Saudi Arabia has been prepared to move its production in both directions to stabilize the market. The quota system at the moment is at least 80% broken because most member countries of OPEC are physically incapable of producing more than they can do. So for most member countries, the quotas are really non-binding because they can't produce any more, mostly for technical or geological reasons. In Iran's case, clearly for external political reasons. And for that reason, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates are the only countries that have been able to raise production and are able to raise production. And if you look in the other direction, most OPEC member countries, again, except for those three, are very unwilling to cut their production to support prices until we see prices dipping, in the case of 2008, 2009, below $40 a barrel. So there's a dysfunctionality there for various reasons.
How about the leadership of OPEC, Professor Zibakalam? Just how important is it for a country like Iran to have a Secretary General of OPEC? It is fielding a candidate, so is Saudi Arabia. How important is the Secretary General in determining the course of events within a group like this?
As far as the actual oil producing and influencing the price on international market by OPEC is concerned, the OPEC director is not terribly important who he is. But politically it is significant, and obviously Iran has been trying very hard to have a director of OPEC from Iran. And I think, in all fairness, it is Iran's right to have the director, because for so many years, because of the political differences between Iran and the Gulf state, they have not allowed an Iranian to be chief of OPEC, which is unfortunate, because if anything, I think if an Iranian is head of OPEC, it might actually bring more consensus between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
And just looking at a list of former Secretaries General of OPEC, I see that the last time Iran had indeed one of its nationals at the helm of this organization was back in 1964. Julian Lee, do you think that the Saudi Arabian effort to also put forward a candidate, fielding their own candidate, is in a bid to block the Iranian candidate, because the OPEC Fund, which is an organization within OPEC itself, also headquartered in Vienna, has a Saudi national at its helm? I mean, could we possibly see two Saudi nationals at the helm of two such organizations at the same time? Is this simply a ploy to block the Iranian candidate?
I don't think the Saudis fielding their own candidate is an attempt to block Saudi Arabia, and I mean, I'm not party to the internal politics of Saudi Arabia with regards to Secretary Generalship of the OPEC Secretariat. What I do know is that both Iran and Saudi Arabia have each had one of their nationals as Secretary General on one occasion. The Secretary General is supposed to be a non-partisan figure. OPEC is an organization that operates by consensus, and I think there has always been an attempt within OPEC to try to agree on a candidate who is not politically contentious. And I think in this kind of situation where you're operating by consensus, Saudi Arabia doesn't need to field its own candidate in order to block the Iranian candidate, should it so want to. Similarly, the Iranians would be, and you know, both countries have in the past blocked each other's nominations for Secretary General, and very often we have seen as a result of that we've had a sort of consensus candidate emerge from one of the other member countries, and indeed for substantial periods of its existence, we've had an acting Secretary General rather than a formally appointed Secretary General, and that may well happen again.
And that consensus candidate may well come from Ecuador, if there is no agreement, obviously, on a Saudi Arabian or an Iranian national. Professor Zibakalam, given all these divisions, which aren't new within OPEC, how robust does the organization look to you today?
Certainly, OPEC has declined to be as significant as it was, let's say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. OPEC at some stage was producing about more than the 75% of the crude oil at the international market. Today, as you correctly mentioned, it's less than 40%. So OPEC is actually losing its significance internationally. We are observing Nigeria, Britain, Russia, and non-OPEC producing countries that are occupying the demand for the market, and I think this trend will continue, the decline of OPEC internationally.
Professor Zibakalam in Tehran and Julian Lee in London, thank you both very much indeed for joining us for this discussion. And thank you very much for joining us as well, and for your time here on Inside Story. We welcome, as always, your feedback. Send us your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.